We'll now move to the second half of this morning's session with a discussion on our report on vaccine research and development. I'd like to introduce one of the co-chairs of that report, Enriqueta Bond, who is founding partner in QE Philanthropic Advisors. So Dr. Bond, over to you.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everybody. I think you're going to hear a lot of the same themes echoed in our report that you just heard. I'd like to say thank you to the Office of Global Health Affairs for the privilege of carrying out this study. We know you have a lot of expertise, but we were delighted to participate in your efforts, ongoing efforts. Next slide. So we had a diverse, well-rounded committee that covered basic clinical, manufacturing, and regulatory science. Unfortunately, we lost one of our members along the way. And I want to do the same shout out to our excellent staff, without whom we would never have been able to conduct this study. Next slide. So our statement of task, next slide. First, we wanted to assess how lessons from COVID-19 and other prior epidemics have changed the research and development ecosystem and explore how these advances could be applied to pandemic and seasonal influenza. Secondly, we were asked to review the need for novel vaccine development platforms beyond the traditional processes, that is, the egg-based vaccines. 3, we were to discuss the implications of the existing seasonal flu response ecosystem on future flu pandemics and consider how emerging technologies can be applied to management of both seasonal and pandemic influenza outbreaks. Next. 4th, we were asked to recommend actions to strengthen and diversify the use of vaccine production facilities and novel vaccine technologies, covering the gamut of various technologies and business strategies that could be sustainably and rapidly adapted. 5th, we were asked to consider the effects of issues such as viral drift, repeat immunization effects, seasonal flu vaccine effectiveness, and intellectual property on the technical, regulatory, and policy feasibility of recommended actions. Next slide. 6th, we were asked to recommend ways to build capacity for accelerated vaccine development and delivery against pandemic influenza viruses. And finally, to consider mechanisms to better coordinate and integrate research and development processes for newly developed vaccines with cohesive vaccine distribution and post-approval surveillance efforts. And these considerations include streamlining vaccine and drug discovery, clinical testing, intellectual property management, and other international policy barriers that may impede or delay development. Next. So our committee took the following approach. Our feeling was that the rapid development of COVID-19 vaccines really has demonstrated what is possible when researchers have the necessary resources and novel technologies to conduct and apply their research. And with rolling review by regulators and public-private partnerships, as well as extensive data, that was a striking and leading lesson that we learned. And during our initial committee meeting, it was decided that the issues fit within 4 dimensions. And those were used to structure our meetings and also our report. So you will see that we have chapters on basic and translational science, on clinical science, on manufacturing science, and regulatory science. Next. So before I delve into the recommendations for each of them, let me just pull out a few of the themes that I heard in the first presentation that you will again hear through our presentation. First of all, influenza and COVID differ, but influenza preparedness efforts have facilitated COVID vaccine development, and now we can take lessons from COVID development to improve and expand the influenza preparedness efforts. Second, as one of the questions demonstrated in our last presentation, most experts believe that influenza will be the next pandemic because of past pandemics and the genetics reassortment, global distribution, and its respiratory aspects. As we heard, work to develop a universal vaccine is ongoing, but the goal has not been reached. Next, influenza vaccines are now largely produced from inactivated virus grown in chicken eggs and are not very effective. We need faster and more platforms, such as RNA and recombinant protein platforms, but the presence of a cheap and approved vaccine are a barrier to development of other platforms without adequate sustained investment. As we saw from slides in the previous report, most manufacturing capacity is in the developed world. Lower middle income countries do not vaccinate for seasonal influenza due to other health priorities, and we would need many more doses than are currently produced for seasonal influenza in a pandemic situation. And very importantly, we need global regulatory and surveillance systems to facilitate combating a pandemic. So here go our recommendations, which follow through on some of the themes that you've heard in the past. HHS through NIH, NIAID, BARDA, and DOD, as well as other corresponding governmental and funding agencies domestically and abroad, should invest proportionate to the enormous cost of pandemics in basic and translational science, that we can deliver a diverse array of influenza vaccines using different platforms, viral targets, adjuvants, and delivery systems to optimize the control of influenza across diverse settings and phases of pandemics and epidemics. One figure that is quoted in our report is that the global cost of a pandemic is $570 billion, whereas control of a pandemic would require something like $4.5 billion of investment, which is the World Bank estimate. Next slide. So for basic and translational science, as I mentioned, continuous funding for vaccine R&D is vital for preparedness, but it's often not sufficient. COVID-19 has resulted in a paradigm shift in vaccine technology, presenting benefits for rapid development of pandemic vaccines and improving seasonal influenza vaccine effectiveness. As seasonal egg-based influenza vaccines have low to moderate efficacy and require annual updates, significant funding is needed to develop more novel platforms and technologies that may lead to vaccines that are more efficacious. And this will require building additional production capacity to include accommodating regions where capacity may be limited, where it is limited. This will also implicate greater application of assays that induce immunity through mechanisms other than strain-specific neutralizing antibodies and validating correlates of protection, which are currently used by the FDA, which means there isn't much incentive to move beyond. Next slide. So as it relates to these sort of findings, the recommendation 2.2 is the WHO working with multilateral stakeholders, for example, CEPI, governments, funding agencies in the vaccine industry, and philanthropic organizations should advocate and build global capacity for robust and internationally comparable preclinical, clinical, and immunologic assays of influenza vaccine candidates, including novel candidates that use other structures, targets, and delivery systems to potentially broaden or improve what is limited protection at this time. Next. Recommendation 2.3, international research networks supported by governments and funding agencies, WHO and the vaccine industry should support and conduct multi-center international clinical trials and field studies to compare these emerging vaccines that we believe are needed with standard egg-based vaccines in geographically, demographically, and immunologically diverse populations so that they have the data to inform rational and situation-based use and manufacture of an extended array of vaccines. Next. Recommendation 2.4, national regulators should engage with the vaccine industry and academic researchers in the development, standardization, and implementation of assays to evaluate vaccines that induce immunity through mechanisms other than strain-specific neutralizing antibodies and establishing, validating correlates of protection. Next. On the clinical side, we felt that the expansion of clinical trials globally, particularly in low and middle income countries, can decrease the risk of such large investments and fill clinical funding gaps. That clinical studies of influenza vaccines need to represent the diversity of the population studied, and early studies should prioritize high-risk groups. Population-based studies should measure differential effects in subpopulations with consideration of characteristics such as racial, ethnic, socioeconomic, age, pre-existing medical conditions, and diversity within and across countries. And that coordinated global pharmacovigilance systems are needed really to ensure vaccine effectiveness and safety data are timely and complete. This will reassure the public and enable approvals. Next. So with these findings, our first recommendation under clinical science was that the WHO, in collaboration with national public health agencies, should conduct burden of disease studies in lower middle income countries to understand the health and economic burden of influenza illness and barriers to immunization in adult populations. We need to really build the infrastructure and capacity in these countries needed for pandemic vaccine development and implementation. And if we have cost-benefit analysis that include additional economic productivity losses due to delayed access to a vaccine in a pandemic, this will enable better use of vaccines. Next. So the International Coalition of Medical Regulatory Authorities and WHO, in partnership with national regulatory and public health agencies, should invest on a global level in data infrastructure and capacity building to conduct those real-time sentinel site surveillance of vaccine safety and effectiveness of the different vaccine products deployed for use both in epidemics and pandemics in diverse populations, including a plan to ensure coordination, collaboration, and data sharing across these sentinel surveillance sites. I think sites, as we heard in the previous presentation, this is a great need. Next. Again, the International Coalition of Medical Regulatory Authorities and WHO should ensure international coordination and collaboration on timely and transparent review of vaccine safety data during epidemics and pandemics to support the real-time decision-making about the use of these vaccines. Safety data should be made available to support country-level benefit risk assessments because each different population and country are going to have a different benefit risk assessment, particularly in lower middle income countries relying on regional data from sentinel sites conducting safety surveillance. Next slide, please. So findings under manufacturing science, we found that expanding manufacturing capacity in lower middle income countries can help avoid the delayed rollout of vaccine in LMICs, that it's vital that these models not only be sufficient, but self-sustainable to ensure that production can keep up with the urgency of demand in pandemic conditions. Public sector investments and improvements to data sharing infrastructure can aid manufacturing centers able to mobilize quickly during the pandemic. Financial aid may also incentivize vaccine manufacturers to assume more risk in building infrastructure. This was certainly critical in COVID, And eligibility for such funding should be contingent upon participation in R&D, data sharing, technology adoption, and training activities with international partners. So with these findings, next slide, please. Recommendation 4.1 was that HHS and WHO should develop a plan for sufficient global supply of influenza vaccines for pandemics, which includes convening, supporting, and encouraging vaccine manufacturers to benchmark, prioritize, and harmonize influenza vaccine manufacturing, and enhancing and expanding support of the global influenza vaccine manufacturing network, creating manufacturing hubs for greater collaboration and building capacity to address the challenges in manufacturing in LMICs. Next. Vaccine manufacturers should take that risk-based approach for pandemic influenza preparedness that would include participating during research and development, data sharing, technology adoption, and training activities with international partners, growing international capacity to assess the production needs and their risks, using scientific evidence to design strategies to reduce risk, such as WHO pre-qualification, licensing, marketing, etc., and formalize technology transfer, the scale up and scale out activities, taking into consideration timeliness and the outcomes for equitable costs, access, and distribution. Next. For regulatory science, our findings which drove the recommendations were that regulators should develop comprehensive and transparent guidelines for how to conduct preclinical and early clinical trials between pandemics and develop pathways for rapid review of vaccines for pandemic strains, that such efforts should include provisions for optimizing passage through regulatory pathways, including improved understanding of correlates of protection, which was certainly in place for COVID and was a great facilitator, that regulatory agencies should work closely with public health to ensure that the public receive accurate and streamlined messaging about vaccine development and approvals. As a gesture of goodwill, vaccine manufacturers are encouraged to share vaccine trial results and updates in regulatory review. So with that, our recommendations follow. Next, the FDA and other national regulators working with the scientific community and pharmaceutical industry should establish comprehensive guidance for the development of influenza vaccine on novel platforms through emergency use authorization to full licensure. This guidance should provide pathways for both seasonal and pandemic influenza, so that there might be a way to use the seasonal influenza to develop the platforms that are needed for the pandemic. Next. The FDA and other national regulators should commit to transparency in the oversight of clinical trials, review of data authorization, and approval of pandemic influenza vaccines, including the release of facility inspection findings, clinical trial protocols, and clinical data that are the basis of decision-making. Regulators should convene independent advisory committees to build public understanding and confidence prior to the authorization or approval of novel vaccines. Next recommendation. The WHO and the International Coalition of Medical Regulating Authorities should facilitate coordination between regulatory and public health agencies when announcing different decisions on the same or similar vaccines to explain the different underlying circumstances and judgments. I think we saw a lot of confusion during COVID, and we need to be sure that the risk benefit of different or similar vaccines in different circumstances and in different populations is well understood by the public. Next. Vaccine manufacturers should adopt a code of conduct for press releases and other communications regarding vaccine trial results and other matters, which emphasize the critical role of regulatory review. Next recommendation. So as a summary, overall summary of our recommendations, I think there are two takeaways. One is that having vaccine earlier and ensuring they're widely and equitably available, including through building vaccine production and distribution capacity in lower middle income countries in a future influenza pandemic, could significantly reduce both the burden of disease and the social and economic consequences, both domestically around the world. And we believe that we've provided a blueprint that the world can leverage what has been learned so far from the COVID-19 pandemic to effectively prepare for the next influenza outbreak. I'd like at this time to ask my co-chair, Kanta Subbarao, to add any of her comments to this summary.
Thank you, Keta. Don't know if you can see me, but it's been a real pleasure to work with this committee and discuss these diverse issues. The only thing I would add to what Keta said is that influenza is unique in some ways. I mean, there's so much that we can learn from COVID-19, but the lessons sort of go both ways. There was a lot from the influenza experience that informed COVID-19, and the converse is true as well. So what's unique about influenza is that we have vaccines, we have these phenomenal network for surveillance, we have an international collaboration, we've got excellent interactions with the manufacturers. We've got an increasing diversity of vaccine platforms that are available, but there's still room to improve. So we do need better vaccines, and we need to be able to move into using or investigating some of these, and certainly, having sustained and proportionate funding to be able to support this. And the other challenge with influenza is because we've got an existing influenza vaccine, there's a bit of a hurdle in trying to take a new concept through to clinical trials. So those are some of the things that we've talked about. And of course, that's just in addition to all the points that Kate has just gone over. Thank you.